ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show. You're watching your top human rights organization review, and I'm your host, Bryce Dolan. Now, today on the show, we're going to look at 5 different top human rights organizations and look at the top stories from each one of their websites. To begin our show today, in an earlier segment, we called for Mr. Darboe and 18 other activists to be released from jail in Gambia. They were convicted on July 20th and sentenced to 3 years in prison for participating in peaceful protests. They were found guilty on 6 counts relating to participating in unauthorized protests on April 16th in the outskirts of the country's capital, Banjul. The court ordered them to hand over their passports as well. Well, according to Amnesty International, Mr. Darboe and the other activists have been released. Following the release on bail of Mr. Darboe and 18 other peaceful protesters by an appeal court in Gambia, Sabrina Martini, Amnesty International's West Africa Anglophone researcher, said, "The release of Mr. Darboe and the 18 other peaceful protesters on bail is a big moment for them and their families, and we hope that this positive step indicates that they will be fully acquitted in due course. We must also not forget other prisoners of conscience who still languish in jail simply for having expressed their opinion or participated in peaceful protests. These include 3 imams arrested by the security forces over a year ago and not seen since. Their only crime? Presenting a petition to the government." So as we see a new president come in and win an upsetting, shocking election against the 22-year reigning current president of Gambia, we hope this switch in leadership will come about of better respect for human rights for the people of Gambia. We hope to see with this new leadership coming into the government in Gambia that more of these peaceful protesters, more of these human rights defenders and activists that are in jail and prisoners of conscience will soon be released and will hopefully be released by the new government. Now, staying on the topic of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is a right and a fundamental tool in the defense of human rights. Many governments continue to trample on this right. They use methods such as censoring, threats, and even imprisonment to silence human rights defenders. Just when social networks are becoming a platform for those who defend freedoms, many countries such as Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Malaysia deride human rights by incarcerating defenders solely for using Twitter to denounce the abuses committed by their governments. It's hard to believe, but a tweet of fewer than 140 letters can land a human rights defender in jail these days. With its Retweet for Freedom, the International Federation for Human Rights, or the FIDH, hopes to obtain freedom for the forgotten defenders who are in prison for having tweeted. Ever since 2011, Bahrain authorities have been relentlessly harassing Nabil Rajab, president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights and the FIDH Deputy Secretary General. On May 14, 2015, an appeal court confirmed Nabil's sentence of a firm 6 months of prison for having insulted public institutions and the army on Twitter. He served half of his sentence before receiving a royal pardon. He began being harassed again on June 13th of 2016 and is now behind bars. He risks 15 years of imprisonment for other tweets promoting human rights. Eric Paulson, human rights lawyer and executive director and co-founder of Lawyers for Liberty, has been charged with sedition and spent 2 days in custody because of a tweet he posted on January 9th, 2016. In a reply to the defense minister comments on Twitter, he denounced the rise of extremism within the Malaysian Department of Islamic Development, the JAKIM. Subsequently, the Inspector General of Police tweeted that such a statement ought to be investigated under the Sedition Act, and that PDRM will investigate under the Sedition Act, with the word biadab, which means impolite or poorly brought up in the Malay language. Following that, the tweet went viral and Mr. Paulson received insults and death threats. Because of state and public pressure, he deleted his tweet. No trial has yet been scheduled. So to help advocate for these human rights and to help protect these human rights defenders who are using Twitter to tweet out these abuses of human rights, let's help them spread the word with the hashtag retweet for freedom. So go ahead and spread that around Twitter. We're going to make that our hashtag for the day. Hashtag retweet for freedom. Now moving on next to Human Rights Watch. Did you know that a 14-year-old child can legally marry in New York State? Ending child marriage is urgent because it is deeply harmful to children wherever they live. Married children often drop out of school and are locked in poverty as a result. Married girls often become pregnant soon, and early pregnancy involves serious health risks for pregnant girls and their babies. Girls who marry earlier are at higher risk of domestic violence than women who marry as adults. Married girls often face extra barriers in escaping an abusive or unhappy marriage and accessing shelter and legal assistance. These facts are true as well for the United States and other Western countries, where child marriage is less visible than in Africa, Asia, or the Middle East. Most European countries and U.S. states set 18 as a minimum age for marriage, but many have exceptions permitting marriage at earlier ages with the consent of parents or permission from a judge. Under these exceptions, the age at which a child can marry falls, for example, to 16 in Austria, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, and the UK, to name only a few. In some US states and European countries, there is no minimum age below which a judge cannot permit a marriage. In New York, between 2000 and 2010, 3,853 children under 18 married, with permission from parents, judges, or both. In the vast majority of cases, it was girls marrying adult men. In 2014, 3% of Serbian women aged 20 to 24 reported that they married before age 18. This should stop. Some frameworks are already in place. Governments, including the US, have recently committed to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which include a commitment that by 2030, every country will eliminate all harmful practices such as child, early, and forced marriage. This is the final week of the annual 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Because of its devastating effect on girls, child marriage is considered gender-based violence, and it too often leads to violence in the home. Western governments should do their part to end child marriage everywhere. So hopefully that goal by the United Nations of ending child marriage or eliminate all harmful practices such as child marriage or early and forced marriages by 2030. So they have another 14 years to really get to really accomplish these goals and call quits to child marriages. I did not know that in some states here in the United States there was no minimum age where you had to be married, So that is news to me and very shocking, because it's right, you don't really see those things here in the United States. You really see them more in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, but it happens all over the world. Now next, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, reports an estimated around 60,000 people have been forced to leave their homes in Aleppo since August. Now it's been a little while since we've touched on Aleppo, so here's another update. 20,000 fled just over the past 72 hours, and many more thousands left before. Some people live in shelters, some in mosques, schools, or tents, while others found refuge in unfinished or damaged buildings. And some are hosted by families who are already under great strain. Children and youth, all the more so after their ordeal, desperately need and want to go to school. The implications of fleeing home are immense. It's not just a matter of picking a few items and leaving. There's a huge knock-on effect. They need to be guaranteed safe passage and be offered dignified conditions. And they need all the basic necessities such as food, safe drinking water, and medical care, said the ICRC's head of delegation in Syria, Marianne Gasser. Aleppo used to be a city over 2 million people, but with so much fighting and displacement, it is impossible to say with any precision how many people are left today. Now we'll continue to have updates about Aleppo and Syria until the Syrian conflict comes to an end. Now to end our show today, UN Watch saluted Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for his government's principled stand at the United Nations on Wednesday in voting against each of 6 Arab-sponsored resolutions singling out Israel, part of a total of 20 unbalanced and inflammatory texts adopted each year in the ritual scapegoating of the Jewish state. Prime Minister Trudeau is showing moral leadership by continuing Canada's exemplary UN tradition over the past decade in joining a small handful of principled nations who are unafraid to defy the intimidation of dictatorships who use the demonization of Israel to distract attention from their horrific human rights record and failed governance, said Hillel Neuer, the Canadian-born executive director of UN Watch. Canada's voting record is entirely unchanged from last year, and once again upholds the UN Charter's principle of equal treatment of all nations, added Neuer. One resolution effectively calls on Israel to transfer control of the Golan Heights to Syria, oblivious to the mass killings now being perpetrated by the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Another resolution condemns Israel for actions in Jerusalem and uses only the Islamic term for the Temple Mount, ignoring the site's biblical role in Judaism and Christianity. The UN's assault on Israel this week with a torrent of one-sided resolutions is surreal, said Neuer. It's astonishing. As the Syrian regime is killing its own people by the hundreds of thousands, how can the UN call for more human beings to be placed under Assad's rule? The timing of this resolution is morally galling and logically absurd. And while there will be a total of 20 inflammatory, unbalanced, or redundant resolutions against Israel this session, it is telling that not a single UN General Assembly resolution is planned for victims of gross human rights abusers such as Saudi Arabia, Burundi, Turkey, Venezuela, China, or Cuba. The UN's disproportionate assault against the Jewish state undermines the institutional credibility of what is supposed to be an impartial international body. Politicization and selectivity harm its founding mission, eroding the UN Charter promise of equal treatment to all nations, large and small, Neuer added. So, Israel continuing to get attacked by the Arab nations in the UN, and the UN General Assembly continuing to really do nothing about it, and only a handful of a handful of smaller nations like Canada are willing to stand up with their opinions and say, no, that's not right, you shouldn't be doing that, these resolutions are not right, these shouldn't be going through. So that has been a heated issue all year long, is there's been over 20 of these resolutions now, all against Israel. So we'll keep updating you with the UN and Israel and see what really happens here in the end. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you can find the links to all of these stories below in the description. I encourage you to check them all out. While you do that, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, give us a like on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. But that does it for the show today, ladies and gentlemen. Again, I encourage you to check out the articles. Please do. The links take you directly to all of their websites and the entire articles themselves. So again, thanks for watching the show, ladies and gentlemen. This was your Top Human Rights Organization Review, and I was your host, Bryce Dolan.